Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Ritchie, and I'm the president of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We're the sponsoring organization this evening, but I want to recognize the contribution of all the other co-sponsors and our friends here at Hunter College who really made it possible for us to pull this together this evening. This event tonight is the last in a series of conferences that we've organized on the 50th anniversary of the major post-World War II international institutions, the United Nations, the Food and Agriculture Organizations, the World Bank and the IMF, and what we now call the World Trade Organization. And our goal was to try to understand more what was the political context of that period in which these institutions were created, and to understand more about what has happened in the intervening years and where we want to take these institutions in the future. Some of you know our organization and know that we've been some fairly severe critics of some of the actions of some of these institutions, but we've also been very committed to understanding because we knew that they came out of a period of war and fascism, and were reactions to that period and were attempts by people to build a system, an international system, a system based on human rights, on the rule of law, on the respect of individual people and the rights of workers and other people, to build a new kind of future for the planet after a couple very horrible world wars. I think we have to be frank about how complicated and difficult and bloody and very painful this century has been. But I also think that some of the creations and the institutions built in this century, and tonight we are honoring that one that I think is the most important, that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that these institutions are part of the legacy that we will be leaving for the next generation. When I thought about tonight, I thought about the fact that a number of people here in this room, and perhaps even myself, will be here at the 100th anniversary of the UN adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We want to be able to say, of course, that we've gone much farther than we can. In fact, again, being quite candid, although the activities in the last few weeks with the arrest and detention of General Pinochet is an incredible advancement in terms of international human rights. Some of the developments in the criminal court and in some of the new developments that we see are quite positive. But any kind of frank assessment of where the current administration has been on human rights, and also with our own performance in the areas of economic, social, and cultural rights, tell us that we have a lot more to do. And the 100th anniversary, we want to be able to say that we've begun to really achieve and have those human rights as being real examples for people. Tonight's program was designed to be kind of a beginning of a new direction, beginning of a new conversation, beginning of a next 50th years. And the thing that was important when we put this together was that we were very clear about this very disturbing separation between the civil and political human rights and the economic, cultural, and social human rights. You'll hear more tonight from Dr. Howard Schomer, who was one of the people there at the original writing of the Declaration, that there's a lot of history to that separation and how it was involved with the Cold War and many other things. But as a practical matter in this nation today, it's clear that the economic rights are the rights that are in the public struggle. The so-called welfare reform bill, what's happening in health care, the rising number of people who are hungry, the explosion in the people using food banks, the homelessness in this city of such incredible wealth. These are all symptoms and signs of how far we have to go. So in this weekend conference and in the period ahead, we won't just be reflecting on how great it was to have a universal declaration, nor will we be just lamenting, gee, isn't it terrible how poorly we've done in achieving them. We'll be trying to honor the contribution of the people who wrote and fought for and made that declaration possible. We will try to be honest and forthright about the shortcomings and the struggles ahead, but we will try to understand how we apply the vision and the hope that's so tied up in this document into the very specific struggles of turning these hopes and dreams into reality. Tonight's speakers will give us different flavors of that, different aspects of that, to help guide us through this weekend. I think some of you have registered for the weekend conference. There's about 150 people registered for the whole weekend conference, and you will be part of a broader discussion about where we go from here. A number of different organizations brought together by the Kensington Welfare Rights Organization have been meeting all today and over the course of the last year, also laying out very important directions that I think we will see aspects of it over the weekend to help give guidance and leadership. We'll also be hearing about some of the other activities being planned. I want to draw your attention to this. Peace is a human rights poster that's in the packets and out on the tables. Tonight, we'll hopefully talk a little more about that, but over the course of the weekend, we will be talking about this very important conference coming up next year on the 150th anniversary of the Hague Peace Appeal, about the need to abolish war and to make peace as a human right quite central. So we'll be talking about things to do, directions to go to make this vision, this dream, this hope into a reality. Tonight our speakers will be giving you some stories and some specific examples. We'll be opening with a very special guest, two women who are UFC, United Food and Commercial Worker members from the Delmarva Peninsula, organizing down there in the poultry industry. The man who sort of brought a revival to the labor movement, our president, John Sweeney of the AFL-CIO, will be introducing them to begin our evening. Our second speaker will be Charles, or Charlie as we all call him, Kernaghan. Some of you know him from his work with the National Labor Committee, but his courage, and that's the word I use whenever somebody asks me about Charlie, his courage in risking his life and risking all that he's done to help bring the issue of sweatshops and child labor and slavery back to the American agenda, putting it in the media, putting it on the political platform. Charlie will be talking about that and what that is in his vision about human rights. After Charlie, we're going to honor what we believe is the last surviving person from the original drafting, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is Dr. Howard Schomer has lived a life of trying to put those principles into practice, and he will help us understand the historical context and the political context under which this document was created. And we'll have a chance to try to explore that a little further as we go on. After Dr. Schomer, then the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who all of you know, but is certainly the model of a lifelong human rights activist who applied that in his own life and in his struggles, his civil rights struggle, as some of you don't even know about what an important factor he's been in the family farm struggle in the United States, on the front lines in the labor struggle and many others, and we'll be talking more about how those struggles fit together as well. And then our closing this evening will be Danny Glover, who's serving this year as the Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Development Program, and he'll be closing the evening out, a lifelong activist, human rights activist, especially his work around South Africa has gained him great honor and respect around the world, not to mention his fantastic acting in many movies. So we're going to have a very full evening, and I want to get started. Before we start, however, I want to thank a couple people who really made this event tonight and this weekend possible. Two people in particular in terms of providing financial support. Larry Cox from the Ford Foundation, who saw the importance of bringing economic, social, and cultural rights back into the heart of the human rights movement, and the need to bring human rights activists more firmly into the social justice movement, was one of the major financial contributors to this conference. And also the Samuel Rubin Foundation, in particular Cora Weiss, who's very involved in this peace conference. Cora, whose whole life has been dedicated to building the human right to peace and all that that implies for the other aspects of our lives, provided very important financial support for tonight. And I also want to recognize and thank the staff of IATP who worked day and night to put this together. And we had very, very amazing help, even from overseas, particularly Angelika Weber, who came over to IATP from Germany, where she works at FIAN International, which is the International Human Rights Organization for the Right to Food, and it's been a very big part of putting this on. And also Sharon Layden, who some of you have met, but I want all of you to meet, who's the amazing person who put this event together. Sharon unfortunately ignored Article 24, the right to leisure, for the last 6 to 9 months to put this together. But we're going to try to make that up tonight at the end of the evening. For some of you who need more Article 24, rest and leisure. Those who need more rest, we'll try to quit on time. And for those of you who would like some recreation, we're going to have dance music here. That's what's behind all of this. Till late in the evening, and we urge and welcome you to join us for as long as you can. But we've got a full evening, and I want to get started. Our first speakers, I want to ask President John Sweeney to come introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for all that you and Sharon and all that are associated with this institute are doing, not only just to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to focus attention on economic, social, and cultural rights, but all of the other good work that you have been associated with. Mark, I just want to assure you at the outset that we all want to be here with you at the 100th anniversary. The American labor movement is proud that Phil Murray of the CIO was a consultant at the drafting convention for the Declaration in San Francisco in 1945. And I am delighted to be able to represent the 13 million working men and women of the AFL-CIO and their families at this observance. Joining me here this evening are two working women who are living examples of why such discussion is so vital, and indeed why it is so important to focus on economic, social, and cultural rights in the United States during this anniversary celebration. Both of these women live with their families on the Delmarva Peninsula between the Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay, not far from Washington, D.C., and they work in the poultry industry. They will share their personal stories with you in a few moments, but I would like to introduce them to you at this time. Maria Martinez is a single mother of two who was born in Mexico and came to this country 11 years ago. She has been working in a poultry plant for 5 years, and she just passed her citizenship exam, and I think she should have a round of applause. Phyllis Slatton was born and grew up in Delmarva, which is called that because the peninsula includes small portions of 3 states, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. She is also raising a family, and she has been working in a poultry plant for 21 years. And I would like to have a little round of applause for her as well. I've asked Maria and Phyllis to stand with me as I make a few remarks, because I really think it is important that we put a human face on our discussion of human rights in the United States. Too often we compartmentalize violations of human rights, especially economic rights, as things that happen only to people in faraway lands, and that is not true. 50 years after the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we regrettably cannot claim that human rights abuses have abated. As if the barbarism in Europe wasn't enough to remind us, the totalitarianism in China this week sent us 5 more postcards from hell. However, we can claim, as the United Nations General Assembly has observed, that human rights violations no longer go unnoticed. And as the long-delayed arrest of General Pinochet proves, some even no longer go unpunished. Over the past 50 years, organizations and individuals dedicated to human rights have worked wonders in bringing public outrage to bear on violations of personal, civil, political, and social human rights here in our country and around the world. Unfortunately, we have paid far less attention to economic rights as provided for in the Universal Declaration: the right to own property, the right to work, and the right to receive equal pay for equal work, freedom of movement, and the right to organize and to join a labor union. And we have paid less attention to economic rights here in our own country than we have in other countries. One of the people who has been paying a lot of attention to economic as well as social and cultural rights is Charlie Kernaghan, the director of the National Labor Committee, whom you heard a little bit about just a few minutes ago, and whom you will hear from a little later in the program. In his presentation, I think Charlie will tell you his horrible sweatshop stories, how women workers in El Salvador are earning 60 cents an hour, making shoes that Nike and Adidas sell for $150 a pair, and how workers in Honduras are paid 54 cents an hour to manufacture clothing, which is then sold by Walmart through its Made in America campaign. I think Charlie will also tell you stories about workers in Burma who are forced to forge their own economic shackles by working for 4 cents an hour in plants co-ventured by prestigious chains like J.C. Penney, Sears, and Marshalls, and a military dictatorship which uses its share of the profits to buy more arms to keep the workforce in line. Because of Charlie's crusades and similar efforts by Jay Mazer at Unite and Doug Doherty and the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and I see Greg Denier here tonight representing UFCW, and we had some great activities during the week down in Middle America on behalf of the workers at Walmart, and you'll hear more about that later. And also the work of the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center offices, which are in 27 countries. We're beginning to learn the awful truth about workers around the world who are slaving their lives in sweatshops and who are denied the right to join or form a union in order to fight back and provide a better life for their families. But what you hear less about, and what I want to concentrate on this evening, is the problem of economic rights and how it violates and sweatshops right here in our own country. Some of our domestic sweatshops could have been imported directly from China or Central America or Bangladesh. They are grimy, unsafe factories and plants where workers sew clothing, produce automobile parts, automobile batteries, cut up chickens and pigs and cows for our dinner tables. And others aren't so recognizable because they are virtual sweatshops, apple orchards in Washington State, strawberry fields in California, nursing homes and office buildings across the country, where workers pick and sweep and clean in the same oppressive conditions. Like their counterparts in other countries, workers in American sweatshops are forced to labor long hours in unsafe, inhumane working conditions for sub-poverty wages. And the cruel irony is that many of them are recent immigrants who fled their own countries for what they thought was an American ideal. Instead, they are confronted with the awful paradox of abject poverty amidst plenty that has become the hallmark of our winner-take-all economy. As we meet here this evening, African American maids are still making up the beds and cleaning bathrooms in glitzy hotels in New Orleans for $5.48, while CEOs staying in those rooms make $3,750 an hour. Latino restaurant workers who have to depend on food stamps to feed their own children are preparing $100 meals for wealthy business people and tourists in Los Angeles. Asian American women are laboring in apparel shops in New York for a sub-minimum wage, while Kathy Lee Gifford and Michael Jordan cart off millions of dollars endorsing the garments the women produce. Workers like Maria and Phyllis are struggling through 12-hour shifts for $7 an hour in awful poultry processing plants less than an hour's drive from the marble palaces of our nation's capital. And like their counterparts in other countries, most of these workers are unable to join together to defend their economic, cultural, and social rights. Not because unions are illegal here as they are in most developing countries, or because union organizers are imprisoned and tortured as they are in China and Indonesia, but because our system of labor laws and protections has broken down. To help us understand what it's like to live and work in the Netherland of American sweatshops, we asked Maria and Phyllis to speak today on behalf of all the workers in the poultry industry. And both of them are qualified to do so because they are members of the Poultry Justice Alliance, which is made up of non-union as well as unionized workers, as well as independent contract growers and elected and religious leaders. Because they work in unionized plants, they are protected by their union contracts from any sort of retribution or retaliation by their employers. But we still don't want to mention the names of those employers. And first we're going to hear from Maria. Maria?
Good evening. My name is Maria Martinez, and I live in the Eastern Shore in Delaware. I'm a single mother of 2 children. When I came to the U.S. as a migrant, I found that I need to have a steady job, and the only job steady in the Eastern Shore is the poultry, chicken plant. I started 5 years ago, and the first processing on the plant, they call this evisceration. In this department, I pull gates. I open the chickens wide. I pull the gates on the side, and so the USDA inspectors can see inside of the chicken to inspect it. I'll do only 35 chickens per minute, but some of my coworkers do 70 chickens per minute. I mean, like, pull 70 livers per minute, or 70 geysers per minute running on the line. Some of the non-union plants run the lines 90 chickens per minute. That make like 150,000 chicken a day, and that kill our hands. And yet, when the value of production is huge, production workers did not gain a proportionate share of the prosperity that we have that labored to produce. In all these 5 years, I've been eligible to have food stamps for me and my children. On the line, working on the line, when a person wants to go to the bathroom, we can't leave the line just like that. We have to ask somebody to take our place, and then we can go, but not leave the lines like that. If we do it, we can be fired. So when we want to go to the bathroom, somebody has to take our place. And if there is nobody so who can take our place, we're in trouble. And I've been seeing people being fired just not for leave the line, but for do pee on the line. 18 months ago, I became a chapter in my plant. And one of these days, my production manager and the human resources manager called me to a meeting. And they start asking me questions about what I was saying. You're complaining a lot, you're doing this, you're doing that, you say this, you say that. And at the end of this meeting, they asked me, Maria, you have all these complaints, but you have something good to say about this plant? And I said, yes. So what is that? And I said, well, that I have a union, and I have a voice, and I can tell you that you're wrong, that you're doing wrong with us. As a migrant, I've been learning for a hard way. And I learned that I have the right to speak, the right to choose, and the right to live. And I want all my coworkers, all the people, not only migrant people, but people who's living here, to have the same right, especially in there on the Eastern Shore. Just last week, I want to comment this because I have to say it. Just last week, one boy, 24-year-old, died. He was working in a chicken plant, and because of the health insurance of that company, he has to go to certain doctors, not to his own doctor. He was from Guatemala, and he died for an ear infection. Imagine a person die for an ear infection just because the company don't want you to go to your own doctor. This company is not union, and they do whatever they want with these migrant people. They don't speak the language. They don't understand. I don't understand the system. Why they do that? Why this guy had to die? I've been collecting money from people so we can send the body to Guatemala. That is not right. So if somebody eats chicken here, please stand up for justice for poultry workers. Thank you.
That's a real courageous worker. And now, before I expand a little bit on some of the other thoughts I want to share with you, I think it would be good to hear Phyllis's story. And I just want to add that Phyllis has just been elected as shop steward for her union, and we're delighted that Phyllis is taking on some leadership responsibilities.
Good evening. My name is Phyllis Slayton, and I work at Allen's Family Food in Harbison, Delaware, and I have been employed there for 22 years. And over that period of time, many things have changed. And one of the major changes is the line speed. The lines are going twice as fast as they used to go years ago. And because of this, there are many problems occurring with people's health. When you come to work in the morning and you begin your workforce, you're on the line and you have a certain amount of chickens to catch. And you stand in that position. Some of them stand there all day long. It's according to what area you work in. And some of them don't stand there. Some of them rotate. But if you don't rotate, the only time you leave that line is for lunch or for break. And the breaks consist of 10 minutes in the morning, and you don't get a break in the afternoon unless you work past 8 hours. And when you go to break, your time for break begins when you step off the line, and you have an apron on and you have gloves on, and if you're working in a real messy area, you have blood and different parts of chickens all over your apron and your gloves, and if you have short sleeves on your arms. And by the time you step off the line to go to break, you have to wash your apron and take your gloves off and your apron because you're not allowed to go to the cafeteria with it on. And in that period of time, you have a chance to go to the bathroom and go to the break room and eat and be back in 10 minutes. And that's not much time for anybody. And because you're not back, you will be written up because that is the policy. And when you come back from lunch, it's the same thing. You stay there until time for you to go home. There is, however, a thing called bathroom privileges where you get a chance to go to the bathroom if you have to go. But if you have to go to the bathroom every single day, they consider you having a medical problem and feel as though you need to go to the bathroom and get a note from the doctor stating that you have a medical problem. And by the lines moving so rapidly, and you have to get every bird that belongs to you in a certain amount of minute, every whatever minute it is that you have to get your bird, every other bird, every third bird, it's causing a lot of problems with your hands. Many people are getting carpal tunnel, where they're, overworked hands from continuously catching that bird as it go by all day long. And as people are injured, the fear begins because you have to go to the company doctor to be seen. And when you go to the company doctor, he'll send you back on the line to go back to work. In some cases, he'll say it's nothing wrong with your hand, and you know that your hand is paining you, and you're there working with your hand, and they say there are no light-duty jobs. And if there are no light-duty jobs, they don't have anything for you to do. And you can't quit. You need to work to support your family. So you just stuck there working in pain constantly all the time. There are very few people that once they're injured get the opportunity, to do something different or to go out on workman's comp. Unless you have a doctor of your own where you've already been involved with that doctor before this new policy came in, then you're better off. And as I begin to think about injuries and people being out of jobs and how hard it is working on that job, I begin to think about the non-union plants. We have it hard in the unionized plants, but they even have it worse because there are some provisions we have that the company just can't do things anyway. They have to go through a policy, a contract, different procedures. But with non-union plants, they have to take whatever they give. They don't have a right to say anything to the supervisor. Imagine that person sitting next to you, being your supervisor, and you ask them to go out to the bathroom, and they tell you, no, you're not going. Or they say something humiliating and embarrass you in front of your coworkers. And if you talk back to them, then you're out of a job. That's what non-union workers have to face. And we're proud to be union workers because it benefits us in many ways. Even though it's a struggle, it still benefits us. We have a good insurance plan compared to non-union plants. We have very good benefits. And I think, when I think of having the right to choose, I looked at this article here that says the 50th Anniversary Conference, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it says, freedom from want and freedom from fear go hand in hand. Our ultimate objective can be simply stated. It is to build for ourselves, for all men, a world in which each individual human being should have the opportunity to live out his life in peace, to work productively, earning at least enough for his actual needs and those needs of his family. And I ask each and every one of you tonight to stand for poultry workers all across the country, non-union as well as unionized, to help us to have these rights. Thank you.
Two wonderful human beings, both Maria and Phyllis's stories. I think we find them shocking, and I wish that I could also say I find their stories surprising, but I cannot do that because I hear similar stories wherever I travel. Workers in different industries in different parts of the country describe similar working conditions and mistreatment, and they all know what happens when you try to join together or to do something about it. What workers in American sweatshops need most is the ability to join together in unions to help give them the power that it takes to deal with their employers and to improve their lives. But the truth is that in this most advanced and industrialized nation, your rights go out the window when you try to form or join a union. No freedom of speech. If you speak up or out for a union, you get harassed or intimidated or discriminated against, even though it is against the law. No freedom of assembly. If you assemble in favor of a union, you get fired illegally, just like 10,000 workers get fired every year in the United States for their union activity. And when do you get your job back? It's hard to say, because there's a backlog of 25,000 cases of illegal firing now before our underfunded and outgunned National Labor Relations Board. The truth is that in this country, which is supposed to set standards for the rest of the world to follow, there are millions of workers who are being deprived of their right to join unions by employers as willing to break the law as they are willing to break the covenants of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Joining a union is a choice workers rightly should be able to make, free of intimidation or coercion by their employers, and that choice is guaranteed by our labor laws. But today, aided by an estimated $300 million a year consulting industry, employers have learned to manipulate the law and harass, stonewall, threaten, and even fire workers for trying to organize. And the bottom line is, they get away with it. I might add that workers up and down the economic spectrum are being denied their rights, just as janitors and farm workers and cooks are being denied theirs. I wish that Raul Garicano could be with us today and tell his story. He worked at KO Steel Foundry in San Antonio for 20 years before he was laid off, never to return after an unsuccessful unionizing campaign. Raul was lucky. 22 of his co-workers were arrested and subsequently deported by the INS at a special luncheon sponsored by their employer to heal wounds after the union defeat. Louise Giese and Karen Sutter were career nurses at Jersey Shore Health Systems in Camden, New Jersey, before they were fired for union organizing activities. Walter Rose, a welder, got the same treatment from Hillman Rollers in Marlborough, New Jersey. How perversive are these practices? We've come to expect the worst from the best. Employers like Red Cross of Pennsylvania, which took a goodly portion of the money we donated to them and hired a notorious union-breaking attorney to beat back a union drive, as did Catholic Health Systems West, which did the same thing at St. Joseph's Hospital in Los Angeles. What's the problem? In the new and unforgivable global economy, employers good and bad are free to scour the world in search of cheap labor, child labor, slave labor. And here at home, they use the specter of that labor to freeze wages, downsize workforces, slash healthcare benefits, cut wages, eliminate pensions, contract out work, and replace full-time, good benefit jobs with part-time, no benefit positions, all in the name of competition. What's the solution? Obviously, a big part of the solution is to restore the right of workers to organize here in this country and to guarantee the same right for workers in other countries. Because union membership is one of the few ways we can prevent workers from being pitted against workers in a race to the bottom. And that's why the American labor movement has insisted, at the risk of being labeled protectionist, that covenants protecting workers' rights and human rights be included in all U.S. trade agreements. Another part of the work, or the solution, is the work being done by Charlie Kernaghan and the National Labor Committee and other groups to expose human rights violations being perpetrated by U.S. corporations and multinationals all across the world. Next year, the AFL-CIO will undertake a similar initiative here in the United States to expose the shoddy practices and corporate irresponsibility of many of our employers who with one hand are gobbling up corporate welfare at record levels, and with the other hand are destroying good jobs and hammering working families by taking a low road to competing in the global marketplace. But we cannot do it alone, and that's why this conference today is so important. Economic, cultural, and social rights are inseparable from our other human rights as set forth in the Universal Declaration 50 years ago. We need the full support of the human rights community in order to defend these rights. One of the things we can do together is to make it clear that we support all of the covenants of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in all forums. And the United States could set an example for the world to follow by ratifying International Labor Organization Conventions 87 and 98, which cover freedom of association and the right to join unions and collectively bargain. The chief reason advanced for our failure to ratify these conventions is that they allegedly contravene state laws. But I would maintain that the states of Maryland and Delaware and Virginia have no more right to violate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights than does the state of Bosnia. Another thing we can do is work more closely together to defend human rights in general and economic rights in particular. And we're getting off to a good start on December 10th, when the AFL-CIO is joining in town hall meetings all across the country to mark the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. And let's get together in conferences like this more often than every 50 years. Maria and Phyllis and Rial deserve no less. And thank you all very much for the good work that you're doing.
Evolution of what Charlie was doing at the time, he began asking some other questions, not just about the personal safety of people who were organizing, but about what about the day-to-day life of people working in those plants. And some of you know parts of the story, and President Sweeney and I talked a little bit about it before. But Charlie Kernaghan's work with his colleagues at the National Labor Committee began to bring into the national media, and I hate to say it, but in this country, if you're not on television, some part of you doesn't exist. They brought what was going on in other parts of the world, especially the activities of U.S. corporations and many of the celebrities here in the United States, their activities in other countries, and brought that home in the most vivid and most dramatic ways. Dramatic enough, I might add, to get my teenage daughter to stop shopping at Gap. And for any of you with teenagers, you know how powerful that must be. Charlie Kernaghan and the work of the National Labor Committee has been the force bringing this back to the political agenda and making it possible for us to begin now to really have a conversation, not just about what's going on overseas, but of course that's very important, and not just about the activities of our corporations overseas, which is obviously very important, but also about those activities here at home and how they fit together and how our response to them has to be part of a broad, entire human rights and workers' rights struggle. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Kernaghan.
Don't go anywhere without my used clothing. Well, I want to, of course, thank Mark and the Trade Policy Institute for all of the leadership they've given on this issue. Really, we ride on their shoulders when we're out there in the trenches organizing. And I think to start with the good news, under President Sweeney, the AFL-CIO has opened its doors to human rights groups, women's groups, students, seniors, solidarity groups, community organizations. It's a different AFL-CIO. And out of that leadership of the AFL-CIO and President Sweeney, for the first time, I'd say the most significant development in the struggle to defend human rights and worker rights in the last several decades has been this growing coalition of labor, religion, students, solidarity groups, women's groups, human rights groups, struggling to hold our corporations accountable for human rights, for worker rights, and for a living wage. I got a call not long ago from the International Labor Organization in Geneva, and they shocked me when they said, we're watching what's going on in the United States because there's no place on earth where the people are so much going up against their corporations to hold them accountable for human rights and for a living wage. So for once, the American people are out front challenging the corporations to make this a more decent society for all of us. Now, that's the good news. The bad news, we all know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We know the right to a job. We know the right to a living wage. We know the right to decent working conditions, to health care. But you've already heard stories of what it's like to work in the poultry industry, which is really where we all belong. All of us in the solidarity community, human rights community, belong shoulder to shoulder with the poultry workers. We belong shoulder to shoulder with NABIT and CWA, which has been locked out by Disney. Well, the bad news, if we take a look at what U.S. corporations are doing and judge it in comparison to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, let's see how well they've met this challenge, or how well they've afforded workers their rights. If we start with one example, we've heard so much about the Nike Corporation, about Nike and its code of conduct and its justice and its Give a Woman a Chance campaign. Well, this shirt was made in El Salvador. It cost $75. It was made in a plant called Formosa Textiles. The women who went into this plant, it was 875 women, basically 20, 25 years of age. They went into the plant at 6:45 in the morning and they come out at 7 o'clock at night. That's 3 hours a day of overtime, but under Nike justice, they're not paid for the overtime. You see, what they do is they make the quota so high, the piece rate quota so high, that there's no way you can reach it in 8 hours. So you stay 9, 10, and 11, and 12 hours for free to make up your quota. This goes on Monday through Friday. On Saturdays, the workers are frequently brought in to work all day free on Saturday to make up for mistakes they made during the week. When vacation time is coming up, they have to work on Saturdays to make up for the days they're going to lose for the vacation or for the holiday. And they're paid, in that case, they're paid straight time, of course, illegally not paid the double time. They come into the factory. The women are put in long rows, production lines, 30 people, 30 women to a line. They sit on hard wooden benches. The factory temperature is about 100 degrees. And this particular factory was owned by an Asian American. But he decided to bring managers, line supervisors from Bangladesh. to El Salvador, to this factory, because they would be very hard on the women. They were very strict. And the line supervisors would go up and down the production line, and they would push the women, scream at them, yell at them, curse at them to go faster, keep up with the production schedule, just like you heard in the poultry plants. They had a technique of coming up next to them and pounding down on the tables to get their attention, to make them go faster. Under the same situations, they would hit the women, push them. They were not allowed to use the bathroom or drink water. They got that privilege once a day. You could go to the bathroom once, you could drink water once, and just like you heard, they had to raise their hand, they had to get permission, they had to be given a ticket, and at the bathroom, there was a guard. And at the sink, there was a guard. This was how they controlled the women's lives. The women were not allowed to talk. Talking is a serious infraction in these factories, making Nike garments. The women were not allowed to bring clean drinking water into the factory, despite the 100-degree temperature and despite the filthy water out of the tap that they were forced to drink once a day. It was a serious crime in this factory to wear makeup. Wearing lipstick would get you suspended, because in the 100-degree temperature, you may pick up the Nike garment and you may wipe your face. And Nike's not going to lose that amount of money with a soiled garment. So it's a serious infraction for makeup. The women are given pregnancy tests when they come into work, which they have to pay for. And if they're pregnant, they're immediately fired. At the end of their trial period, they're given pregnancy tests, which again they pay for. If they're pregnant, they're fired. Workers during the first 3 or 4 months of working in these factories are paid half the minimum wage, which is already set below subsistence levels. As double humiliation, when the women leave the factory, and the few men who work in the factory, when they leave, their body searched. And the men have to drop their pants for the security guards. God forbid they should be taking out a scrap of the Nike garment. The women never heard of the Nike Code of Conduct. They never heard of Nike, knew nothing about it. When we showed them the shirt, that it cost $75, they couldn't believe it. $75 really didn't mean anything to them, but when we translated it into the colonas and said, this is 657 colonas, they couldn't believe it, because that's more than they earn in 2 weeks. And they were shocked, saddened. They were paid 60 cents an hour in this factory in El Salvador. That's about 1/2 of the cost of living. I don't mean living well. 60 cents is 1/2 of what it would cost to climb out of misery and into poverty and hang on by your fingertips, obviously with no luxuries or savings, nothing like that. Well, this was Nike justice. No unions allowed, no organizing allowed. Learning your rights was absolutely forbidden. In fact, El Salvador today is the 8th largest exporter of apparel to the United States worldwide. There are 60 to 65,000 apparel workers in El Salvador. There is not one single union. Despite the low wages, despite the violations, it is not allowed. It is not permitted. Everyone knows that. By the way, in the Nike shirt, there's 20 cents of labor. In El Salvador, the women are left with 20 cents for a $75 Nike garment. We could come back to that. This jacket is a Liz Claiborne jacket. It was also made in El Salvador in a factory called Dual. Costs $198. Purchased it in Macy's. I don't know if you'll be able to see any photographs if I hold it up. But this is what the conditions are in these factories. If you're in Central America or you're in China or Bangladesh, the factories are surrounded by cinder block walls. Generally, they're 10, 12 foot high. On top of the cinder block walls, there's razor wire and barbed wire. And of course, there's a heavy locked metal gate. And the young teenage women line up to go inside. When the door opens, there's always a goon with guns behind the door. He jumped out of the way because he saw my camera, but you can see his head and his sunglasses sticking out. They carry pistols and they carry sawed-off shotguns. Nobody goes in and out of these factories. If a mother or father wanted to go in and see their daughter, if someone was sick, if a message had to be delivered, they can't get in. In fact, I've been in factories when the Ministry of Labor officials were turned away by these private goons and thugs. So all of the production, it goes on behind closed doors. It goes on behind the barbed wire. It goes on behind these thugs and goons, and the women don't stand a chance. That was the factory in which these Liz Claiborne garments were produced. In this particular factory, they worked 7 days a week. They had an interesting schedule. They worked from 6:45 in the morning until 8 o'clock at night, 7 or 8 o'clock. However, 3 nights a week, they worked until 11 o'clock. On Saturdays, they came in and they worked until 5, and on Sundays to 4 o'clock, working 7 days a week. Sometimes on Saturday night, they worked right through the night, a 22-hour shift. They were paid 60 cents an hour to make these garments. 5 times they tried to organize a union. 5 times they tried to learn their rights and defend themselves. 5 times they were met with mass illegal firings and blacklisting. In this particular Liz Claiborne garment, there's 84 cents of labor. Now, 84 cents of sewing in a garment that cost $198. That means that the wages left behind in El Salvador for the young women came to 0.4% of the sales price of the garment. Now, they say they can't pay a living wage, the companies. They can't pay the right to a living wage so that you can climb out of misery and into poverty. But if you were to climb out of misery and into poverty in El Salvador, the wage would have to go from 60 cents to $1.18 an hour. Now, what would happen if Liz Claiborne and its contractors paid $1.18 an hour? Would the sky fall in? In fact, if Liz Claiborne and its contractor paid a living wage to the workers, there would be $1.66 of labor in this garment, which is still only 0.9% of the sales price of the jacket. In other words, they could afford it. Liz Claiborne could afford it, Nike could afford it, they could all afford it. It'd be no problem. One of the reasons I'm raising these companies in particular is, of course, if you've been following the Apparel Industry Partnership or the White House Task Force, well, who do you think is the co-chair of the Apparel Industry Partnership, which is supposed to set human rights, labor rights, and fair wage standards around the world to eliminate sweatshops and child labor? It's Liz Claiborne. Who's the other driving force on the White House Task Force? It's Nike. And who's another driving force on the task force is our friend Kathy Lee. She's, of course, had no trouble crying and shedding the crocodile tears when it was presented to her that children were making her clothing in Honduras, which she bitterly denied. In fact, these pants here were made by 13-year-old kids in Honduras. And the label that you can't see as I carry a blow-up of Kathy Lee around with me wherever I go, she's happy, she's smiling. The bottom of the label is very interesting. It says a portion of the proceeds from the sale of this garment will be donated to various children's charities, which is quite touching. What she left out, and what Walmart left out, was, of course, that the people who made the garment were children themselves. In Honduras, the workers who made the Kathy Lee pants were 13 and 14 years of age. And they had the same schedule, 7 o'clock in the morning until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. They were searched on the way in because the pants were white. There are armed guards in all these factories. Like I said, they're searched on the way in. God forbid they should bring candy in with them. Imagine a Tootsie Roll stain on the white fabric. It's going to cost Walmart some money. It's going to cost Kathy Lee some money. So they're searched and candy is taken away from them. They can't bring water in with them. They can't talk. They couldn't use the bathrooms. They had to raise their hand, the same permission they needed. And when these young kids, these aren't the food and commercial workers, when these young children tried to meet to learn their rights, they were fired, which is when we blew the whistle on Kathy Lee Gifford. And to show you how hard it is to change a system or to change a company as low as Walmart, after all of that tears and crying and we're never going to do it again and we're on the White House Task Force, we happened to find Kathy Lee handbags made in China. Same hand tag. You buy this pocketbook and you're going to help the little kiddies in the United States. What they don't tell you is that the women in China who made this handbag in a factory called Linqing were forced to work 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were paid 12.5 cents an hour. So obviously for the one day, that's $1.25. They worked all 7 days, that's $8.75. However, they were housed in dormitories. So they subtracted $5.41 for dorm expenses. So at the end of a 70-hour, 7-day work week, you made $3.44 sewing Kathy Lee handbags. The women were housed in dormitories where they put 20 people to a room. And they put you in army bunk beds. And they crushed the bunk beds up against each other. And so that there's 2 women on each level of the bunk bed, not one. So one thin army cot would have 4 people on it. 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. And for a little bit of privacy, the women hang up pieces of cardboard or cloth to try to maintain their dignity. The workers are fed a thin rice gruel for breakfast, and for lunch they get stir-fried vegetables, and for supper the same. But the companies aren't inhuman, because if the women work past midnight, as the next morning as a special treat, they don't only get the thin rice gruel, they also get steamed bread, the big treat for the workers if they go past midnight. And of course, in China, there are no independent unions. If you try to form an independent union in China, you're going off to the mental hospital. or you're being incarcerated under administrative detention without a trial. In China, the factories have no names on them. In China, a worker in the factory who even dares discuss factory conditions is immediately fired. These are the conditions that the American companies have sought out. In fact, I wish I had more time to go into it, but in the first 10 months in 1997 alone, U.S. apparel companies imported 1 billion garments made in China. That's 4 garments for every single man, woman, and child in the United States, and those garments were made under these horrific conditions. You know, the most popular selling toy right now is that little Furby talking creature. Kathy Lee had it on television the other day, and she was playing with it and talking to it. It was a strange sight. But someone should tell her that that Furby toy is made in China. It's owned by Hasbro. And in the other factories in China that produce for Hasbro, the Telebabies or whatever it is, the women are forced to work 112 hours a week. They go into work at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they leave at 1 o'clock in the morning. They're allowed to sleep 4 hours a day, and they work 7 days a week. This is typical. They're paid 13 to 26 cents an hour working under those conditions. I wanted to show you one thing. We hear so much about President Clinton and his behavior, so upsetting to the Republicans. These lapel pins were made for the Republican National Convention. The Republicans bought 250,000 of these lapel pins, and they proudly wore them all across the United States and at the convention. And they asked the owner of the company called Avalon, which is a company based in New Jersey, they said to him, how do you do it? How do you make these little pins? How do you make them so cheaply? How are you doing so well? And he made a mistake, and he told the truth. And he said, I'll tell you how I do it. He says, I have a factory in China. I have 250 workers. I own them. They work from 7 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. They live 16 to a room. They work 7 days a week. I pay them 9 cents an hour, and they're mostly little girls from the countryside. So the lapel pins made by little girls from the countryside that he owns and pays 9 cents an hour. But this is rarely raised. We don't hear much about that. We heard about Walmart and the tremendous actions that the poultry workers and the food commercial workers did and the AFL-CIO did yesterday or in Arkansas. We hear so much from Walmart that it's a Buy American company, and that Walmart actually will say that they bring it home to the USA, made right here, support American manufacturers that support American jobs. Walmart goes so far as to say that they have an unprecedented commitment to purchase American-made goods. This is very interesting. We asked Walmart how much of its goods were actually made in the United States, the clothing, the shoes, the handbags, and Walmart said to us they didn't know, couldn't tell us. Sorry, we don't know, which is obviously ridiculous. They track every single product, and they know exactly what they're importing. So we ended up going into Walmart, and we started counting clothing. We counted 105,000 items. It was a mind-numbing experience. It took us over 100 hours in Walmart going around just counting and counting and counting. We found out of the 86,500 pieces of clothing we counted, only 17% were made in the United States and 83% were made offshore. We counted 16,245 pairs of shoes, and only 16 shoes were made in the United States. Not 16%, 16 pairs of shoes. We counted 1,910 handbags, like the Kathy Lee handbag, and everything was made out of the United States. 0 was made in the United States. And in fact, Walmart was lying to the American people, and we thought ourselves, these companies are always threatening to sue us. Why don't we sue them for a change? So we were going to think about suing Walmart for fraudulent advertising until we looked at the small print. Walmart does have an unprecedented commitment to purchase American-made goods. You get to the small print, whenever they can meet the pricing available offshore. So in other words, if you can find a U.S. worker to work for 9 cents an hour, Walmart will buy those goods. That's their commitment. And we would find things like this all across the country when we were going into the Walmart stores. Kathy Lee blouses, exactly the same, $16.96. One tiny difference. This blouse was made in the United States, this blouse was made in Mexico. Otherwise, they're 100% the same. The workers in the United States get paid $8.42 an hour. There's $1.70 of labor in this garment. The woman who sold this got $1.70. In Mexico, the wages are 50 cents an hour. There's 17 cents of labor in this garment, and yet they sell for the exact same price. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know how fast these jobs are going here. And in fact, in the last 12 months, we've lost 68,000 apparel jobs in the United States. In August alone, we lost 100,000 manufacturing jobs in the United States. Well, the companies say to us, why are you always attacking us? Why are you always giving us the bum rap? Why are you always criticizing us? Well, the other day I went into Sports Authority and I picked up this Yankee jersey, which was for the 1998 World Series, and looked inside, and this is made in Burma. Made in Burma, which President Sweeney explained, is one of the most vicious military dictatorships in the world. The military rules by rape, by torture, by imprisonment, arbitrary detention, ethnic cleansing, forced labor. In Burma, you go to prison for 20 years for publicly criticizing the military. In Burma, you go to jail for 15 years for owning a fax machine. In Burma, there's no such thing as private ownership of a factory. You must be in a joint venture with the military. So what do we find? We find a vicious dictatorship in Burma. We find President Clinton moves to put sanctions on Burma to allow the restoration of democracy and human rights. So as of May 1997, no new U.S. investments in Burma were allowed. We have sanctions. Well, I went and looked up the figures. For the first 6 months of 1998, U.S. apparel companies have increased their imports from Burma by 43.43%. We have sanctions, but we're importing 43% more clothing from Burma. We will import $110 million of clothing from Burma this year, 21 million garments. The money that the military earns off this trade with the United States goes right to China to purchase weapons. The Burmese military has purchased $2 billion of weapons since 1988, and it's turned against their own people to torture them. People in the United States would never willingly or knowingly buy a garment made with the murder and the torture and the crying out of the people of Burma. They wouldn't do it. They just don't know. They have no idea which U.S. companies are there. They have no idea which clothing is made there. They don't know that wages in Burma are 4 cents an hour, $8 a month. They don't know in Burma that the minute the worker tries to raise a grievance, the military is brought in. And that worker knows if he or she doesn't shut his mouth or her mouth, they're going off to jail where they'll be tortured. Well, I think we have an enormous work ahead of us, all of us. But I think to end on a positive note, we do deal a lot with the companies. They are extremely nervous about this new AFL-CIO. They're extremely nervous about the growing coalition of religious people with labor, with students, with seniors, with the human rights community, with women's groups. It's got them very upset. And in fact, one of the reasons for the apparel industry partnership, the White House Task Force, was to deaden the movement. Right now in the United States, we're at the first stages of a social movement to hold our companies accountable for human rights and for a living wage. It was so threatening that it was very important that a cap be put on this social movement. And that was the White House Task Force, co-chaired by the Liz Claiborne Company. You know their code of conduct? You know what they want us to swallow, which is why the unions left and why the religious community left the White House Task Force? You know what they want us to swallow? They want us to say that it's okay if they work 14-year-olds 60 hours a week. That's mandatory. Of course, the 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds, they can work 100 hours a week voluntarily. Well, of course they'd work the 100 hours a week voluntarily because they're going to keep the wage at a starvation level. They're saying that we will respect the local minimum wage in those countries, or the prevailing wage, which everyone knows is set below subsistence levels. Well, they say we believe in human rights and labor rights, but don't touch our factories in China, and don't touch our factories in Burma. Oh yes, we believe in universal standards, but in a country like China, all we need to do is the maximum that we can do. That's it. That's the commitment we're going to make to you. We're going to do the maximum we possibly can. We might not get it all, but we'll do the maximum. They tell us to trust them, but they won't reveal the names and addresses of their factories publicly to the American people. They want to continue to hide behind the thugs and the barbed wire and the goons and the cinder block walls. They say to us, we're going to monitor our factories. You know what they want to do? They want to monitor 5% of their factories. The companies are going to pick the 5% of the factories that are going to be monitored. The companies are going to choose the monitors. The company is going to pay for the monitors. The company is going to alert the 5% of the factories that an investigation is going to take place, and based on that monitoring, they will be able to sew a no-sweat label into 100% of their clothing, and they expect us to swallow that. Well, Unite pulled out, the retail workers pulled out, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility pulled out, and we're back to the social movement. They were not able to stop it. And on a final note, I would say, I know there's some students here. This is one of the things that the companies despise the most, that there are 50 campuses across the United States where students are organizing, and they're saying, we want a sweat-free campus. And they're saying to their university administration, you cannot make university goods that carry our logo if you make them under sweatshop conditions. And we demand that every single person who manufactures for the university pay a living wage. We demand that every manufacturer that produces for the university guarantees the right to organize, guarantees public disclosure, guarantees independent monitoring, guarantees that the workers work under safe and decent condition. And this is one of the strongest movements going on in the country right now, and it has the companies quite nervous. So despite all of the bad news and the tragedies that we're hearing about, frankly, there is a tide turning in the United States, and as long as this coalition stays together with the AFL-CIO, with Unite, with the food commercial workers, as long as this stays together with the religious community and the students and with the human rights groups and the women's groups, we really can't lose. This is only the first step of the battle. Thank you.
To the rapporteur of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, which was the body that came out of the UN Founding Convention, which was charged with the task of writing the Universal Declaration. There's a lot in the history, but also a lot in perspective. We'll be hearing from Dr. Schomer. But I wanted to ask a kind of special guest who's here tonight to introduce Dr. Schomer to us. Tran Van Tien, Ambassador Tran Van Tien, is here this evening. He came over with his wife from Geneva. He's a very special friend and mentor for me in my lifelong of learning about human rights and about the international perspective of where we go with these issues into the future. And I want to ask Ambassador Tien to come up and to introduce our special guest. He has a very special relationship to Dr. Schomer that I think makes him the most important, most appropriate person to make this introduction. Ambassador Tien?
Thank you. I'm very pleased to introduce Howard Schomer. But to give some credibility to what I'm going to say about the presentation, I would like to tell you who I am. As you can see, I was born in Vietnam. But France did give me the culture. But in fact, my life is a European and my vocation is European. I did come to Europe in France in 1946. And I did serve after that the European integration for 3 decades and a half. And my career was a success story. But the success story was shaped by Dr. Howard Schomer. He was my teacher in 1946. He did teach me tolerance and human rights. Yes, tolerance and human rights. And for many years, many years, I learned to put in practice tolerance and human rights. Dr. Howard Schomer did not teach me English, but what he did was simply fantastic, because maybe you don't know, outside of the United States, outside America, Howard Schumer did give maybe the best image of America, the best image of America, and he did embody America outside of America. And I hope that he will share with us the memory of what he did about the human rights. And today, after 50 years, we can put the question, what future for the human rights? He does not teach anymore, but I think that as a witness, he will share with us. He doesn't teach, but he will share with us hope for the future. And my personal input to the celebration is the following. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Fantastic. But what about obligations? Maybe human rights and obligation could work better for the next 5 decades of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.
President Ritchie. I suspect the most immediate.
Pleasure. Let's stand up for just a second. Howard, let's check this out. That's that Article 24 again. Now try to.
Okay, that's fine. We get along somehow.
You sure you're going to do it? And your water is here.
That's fine.
And you're all set.
Thank you.
Mike, let me turn it up for you.
Yes.
Can you just a moment? All right, Howard. Just gonna stay like that. Try it.
Thank you both.
Try it close.
Yes. Well, after that act of mercy, I think you won't walk out on me before I take my allotted time. It's a bribe. It's against the law. We're ready now to continue. I'd like to say that we have to make a shift of gears at this point. We want to go back to the beginning of the official relationship of this whole area we've heard so many brilliant illustrations of tonight in the speeches so far. That is, the word was hardly used in public exchanges before the First World War, human rights. One heard of natural rights, one heard of rights of men, one heard of rights of men and citizens with the French Revolution, but there wasn't much talk about human rights, where they come from, what they're for, and who's the boss of them. So we have to take a good look at what was done at the end of World War II to understand how we happen to be discussing tonight GAP and all the other violators of the needed return for one's work. I'd like to thank Paul Tran as I get into this history class. He was in two of my history classes. I think the first economics class he ever sat in was ours in a small college in the heart of the mountains of central France. What I want to say to all of you is then a great thanks for the privilege of speaking to you at this important conference, at this 50th anniversary year of the Human Rights Universal Declaration. I'm going to try to help you catch up on the schedule by skipping a good many links in my speech. I know you're such an intelligent audience, you'll see the connection with things without my necessarily spelling it out to you as I go. I want to describe how the United Nations was created in 1945 and the hopes and the visions that it embodied that have to do with precisely human rights. I would like in the second instance to describe how the UN Commission on Human Rights, created at that time, worked intensely for 3 years, 46 to 48, to produce the Universal Declaration, and how a delicate balance was reached between the Western democracies and the communist and other dictatorial regimes in Central Europe and further east, how political rights and communist regimes had somehow to converse with democratic regimes, and civil rights and intellectual rights had to be brought into harmony with commercial, I meant to say, of course, economic, political, and I will comment on how the final adoption of this Universal Declaration was achieved, after all, with no opposing votes, and how its champions felt about this achievement. And finally, if there is time, as a personal epilogue, I would like to share some thoughts about how this Human Rights Declaration fits into a larger movement for a resurgence of hope in the new millennium. The resurgence of hope in the new millennium. And those attending tomorrow's sessions will find a copy of most of my remarks, which emboldens me to abbreviate them here and there. They'll find it at the end of the background information packet. So let's begin with what the 1945 San Francisco Charter Conference did to design a new kind of world organization, precisely the United Nations. You know, wartime alliances of disparate governments, which were facing a common enemy, have often appeared in the annals of history. Commonly, it's been their fate to disintegrate as soon as their victory was won or their cause was lost, and it gave way to new alliances and new dangers arose. In some early wars, French are fighting English, English are fighting French, and then in others, English and French are fighting together against Germans. Germans and Austrians are fighting against perhaps Russians. And in another war, they may be fighting with Russians against Austria or against one of the other German provinces. These wartime alliances haven't been very stable. And yet here we are gathered to commemorate the 50th birthday of a world organization and its conception of human rights. And we remember that the preceding organization, the League of Nations, only lasted 20 years. We already have in the United Nations the first in history to last a half century. What explains the survival and the expansion of this alliance of the nations through 50 tumultuous years, I think you'd agree, it's not been a quiet time, until almost all the peoples of our globe seem to recognize that this United Nations organization, or something very like it, is indispensable as human history enters a new century and a new millennium. Every time you drive by on a freeway, one of those signs that says, "Get the United States out of the United Nations," and the United Nations out of the United States, Don't let anybody tell you that that represents the feeling of everybody in the town next door. This is a cheap trick to seem to be bigger than you are. In the brief period of those years, 1945 to 48, the basic interlocking structures of this new world organization, which replaced the failed League of Nations, which had made only the careful cultivation of what was then called collective security. Do you remember that? Some of you a little bit older than others. Collective security was the password of what the League of Nations was supposed to provide for the world. It failed to provide it. When Italy entered Ethiopia, the League of Nations did not stop it. And now Italy, which had been at one point a friend with other countries such as France, was soon found in a war on the other side from France. In the brief period of those years then, the basing interlocking structures of this new world organization, which replaced the League of Nations, had to be spelled out. If we would understand fully the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we would have to note that from time to time the interactions between the Commission on Human Rights and the General Assembly of the United Nations, of the Security Council also, especially the Trusteeship Council, and even more especially the Economic and Social Council, shows us that there's a whole territory embraced for new world organization that is very different from the limited collective security or defense tract, which was the charter of the League of Nations. So in my opinion, we do owe the durability of the United Nations to the innovation of the founders in structuring this organization around the two most cherished objectives of every human society down deep. Are they not security, to be sure, from foreign occupation and invasion, but also economic development? That is to say, as the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations says it, it sums up the twin purposes of the United Nations this way. This new organization is intended to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. It is these distinct but complementary responsibilities that have generated the UN's vitality. The evolution of the Allies' anti-Axis wartime military pact into an all-inclusive instrument of collective security and a worldwide coalition for economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian progress was anything but inevitable as the guns were laid down and World War II was over. It was not at all evident that the world was ready to have a new kind of organization and not just one more alliance. When the UN Charter Conference convened in San Francisco on April 25th, 1945, the draft of the Charter laid before it as a model some thought it ought to go, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference of the Big Five, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, the Big Five, prepared a new call for collective security, just like the one that had not worked for any of us under the title League of Nations. So the World Organization's economic and social role was added to that of humanitarian facilitator by the Big Five. If you want to talk about economic things, they said to the other smaller countries, all right, that's acceptable, but your job will be to be humanitarian, Red Cross type of thing. And you're to help facilitate more help for the injured. This was only such a small part of what many of us had in mind. There were at least 3 streams of ideas pouring into the mix at the Charter Conference, beside those of the Big Five. These 3 influences were outlined by a former French cabinet minister who was concerned that the Charter enunciate effective protection for human rights, and he wrote back in those years right after World War II, a vast movement of public opinion was born in England and the United States nearly at the beginning of the hostilities of the Second World War. And this movement grew incessantly in force and in scope as the war rolled on. Hundreds of political, scholarly, and religious organizations, he wrote. Note the 3 categories: political, scholarly, and religious. These organizations have by their publications, by their appeals, by their demonstrations in the streets, their interventions in politics and speeches in the Congress, they've spread and impressed the idea that the protection of human rights should be part of the war aims of the Allied powers, and that the future peace would not be complete if it would not consecrate the principle of international protection of human rights in every country, and if it would not guarantee this protection in an effective manner, not just rhetoric. I think you see that this work had also been well launched already in 1942 by no lesser personality than the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In fact, in his 41 State of the Union nation, that's where he said that with masterly language, which was his particular gift, he shared his vision of those 4 fundamental freedoms which he felt were at stake in the Allied confrontation with the Axis powers: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. But the thing that was most impressive was that the most massive support for this broadened notion of what a world organization should be in the 1950s was offered to conferences. I'm going to skip a page, Drew, help with your time problem. Yes. The most massive output in place of economic, social, and cultural issues raised in the Charter Conference of the United Nations in San Francisco came from several mainline religious traditions which were not satisfied with the fact that the Charter of the United Nations mentions human rights only once, fundamental freedoms twice, and there's no explanation of what a human right is, why it's a right, and whose responsibility it is to see that it is accorded effectively. No explanation of what a fundamental freedom is, so that what happened in San Francisco was that an otherwise excellent charter indicated that its basic vision of the world and in human relations called for precisely some form of unofficial, some form of scholarly, of individual witness, something of what we're now looking for as a way of carrying into greater effective application the rights that we have put into the Charter and into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in dealing with the kind of things that the labor people have told us about tonight. So some of the churches that got behind this call were, I'm going to skip some more. Just down to the Federal Council of Churches in the United States of America. That was the name of the National Council of Churches of today, back in the 40s. At that time, right after World War II, some 30 national Protestant denominations with about 30 million adult members, and with many of their leaders in the denominations and in the councils themselves shaped as committed and intelligent internationalists by many experiences in the 1920s and 30s in several ecumenical conferences in Europe and Asia. Even as the Second World War was breaking out in '39, already the beginning of a movement was discernible in the Anglo-Saxon countries. They set up a strong commission to study the basis of a just and durable peace in the United States. And before the end of the first year of their work, its extensive reports were summed up in a leaflet titled 6 Pillars of Peace. Now, this leaflet had been showered on local churches as the war began. It had been showered on them across the country. It was available at the Charter Conference in Geneva, therefore, in San Francisco, therefore, at the end of the war. One of the middle-sized denominations had already presented to the State Department in the United States 220,000 endorsements of the Federal Council's proposals, the 6 Pillars for Peace, signed by the denomination's most concerned members. Well, here is what they were asking for. You begin seeing the move beyond collective security had taken root among the masses of the people in the United States churches. The New World Organization, they said, should provide a continuing political framework for the collaboration of the United Nations. Sorry, could you bring me some water, please? Yeah. To tell you quickly what the 6 pillars contain. Providing a continuing political framework for the collaboration of those countries that in 1941-42 had called themselves United Nations, not the United Nations, United Nations, as they met with Churchill and Roosevelt on a ship somewhere on the Atlantic Sea. Second thing that the 6 Pillars of Peace called for was to provide mechanisms for negotiating international agreements that would regulate economic acts of national governments and that would impact seriously other national governments. Must consult, must negotiate. The third thing was to provide ways to update treaties when underlying conditions change, so that the organization, modernizing itself from day to day, would represent the continuing current needs of the nations. Provide for the supervised progress of subject peoples, that means colonies, toward autonomy. And incidentally, no effort of the conferees on the question of human rights in America shows greater progress than the fact that the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations in the next 20 years managed to seek and to lead in the independence movements of many of these colonies, in spite of the imperialism that was still a la mode in many schools of thought. And they had already moved beyond the schools of thought without wars to write constitutions and recover the sovereignty of the local people. Not always well used, that's another question, but this was without war for the most part. The colonialization and decolonialization was not primarily a military thing except in 2 or 3 countries of the 80-some that became free countries after the Trusteeship Council began its work. It provided procedures for controlling military establishments everywhere, at least on paper. It established in principle, and it sought to achieve in practice, the right of individuals everywhere to religious and intellectual liberty. Well, clearly, there were both hard-headed reformers and visionary utopians among the churches and other of the 42 NGO groups with consultative status. Many of you are connected with one or another of the non-governmental organization or NGO groups today. Did you know that there were only 42 that sought and obtained consultative status with the United Nations in the time of the charter writing and the writing of the Universal Declaration? But today, those 42 NGO groups have become about 1,000 non-governmental organizations, representatives who have consultative status at the United Nations. And there were 51 member states, with Poland added at the last hour, 52 member states that joined the United Nations by the end of the 1940s. Now there are 185 countries. Far from shrinking away or failing and falling flat on its face like the League of Nations, we have then a world organization in the United States, in the United Nations, whose sovereign states are dedicated not simply to the preservation of the status quo, as was the League of Nations, but the diverse peoples of the whole world were invited to join in a commitment to bring about fundamental social progress and wide-scale environmental development. I want to say something about some of the people now who did this excellent work. I was not personally at the Charter Conference of the UN in San Francisco, but one person who was there, Ambassador Charles Malik of the Lebanon, first ambassador of the first president of the Republic of Lebanon, which had been under Turkish control for 500 years, and then under 100 years under France for another 100 years as a mandated area, as the League of Nations used to call them. This young philosopher had been a leading member of the San Francisco Conference. And in his own person, Dr. Malik, whom I had known well over our college years, and who was himself one of the most brilliant people I have ever met, he was able to fuse the human rights activism that the cabinet article from the French cabinet mentioned, the political, the scholarly, the religious. He was constantly exploring all three of these avenues, and he was constantly receptive to NGOs who could help the nations arrive at a successful declaration. I now skip a few more pages and say when these nations came together, the Big Five no longer were able to dictate their will. Just as the Security Council would be charged to organize the machinery for achieving freedom from fear, a middle-sized nation took the floor to say, and it's Mexico, the Economic and Social Council should lead the nations in the struggle for freedom from need. And the Australian representative of the leader of the Labour Party, Francis Ford, was enthusiastically echoed when he yoked these 2 points, stating that a permanent system of security can be made effective and can be made acceptable, but only if it has a foundation in economic and social justice, not humanitarian kindness, not a small facilitation of trade. It had to be a foundation in economic and social justice. We could now see that under these very soft phrases, there was a desire to make the new organization an agent of fundamental social change. Social progress doesn't frighten the status quo authorities as much as what we just call this. I'll let that sentence go for free. A permanent system of security can be made effective and acceptable, said a middle-sized countryman, only if it has a foundation in economic and social justice. And real international stability can be achieved only by promoting measures of such advancement and by maintaining security. Welfare is not to be used simply to get votes. It's an end in itself, economic, social, cultural welfare. Employment for all, rising standards of living for the masses. These things have been promised, they said, in international declarations such as the Atlantic Charter, where our name was taken on, United Nations, and in the national declarations of policies of most of the socially advanced countries of the world. This pledge should be written into the charter of the World Organization as an objective, and suitable machinery must be provided for the progressive fulfillment of the pledge. Such views won overwhelming support as the UN family grew, and the Social Council, in parallel with the Security Council, became a slogan. And the promotion called for was for higher standards of living, better conditions of economic, social progress and development. The solution of international economic, social, health, and related problems were declared to be the responsibility of the UN and to be monitored by the Commission on Human Rights. Universal respect, therefore, and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, and without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, became a byword in the new organization. I worked with it for the 3 years in Geneva, where the offices were set up in the old Palace of the Nations that the League of Nations had built, but failed to justify having. It became now the European seat of the Secretariat of the United Nations, even as in New York, the Secretariat was being built for the overall headquarters. So the universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, was declared and voted. And a charming and beautiful lady stood up. Her name was Madame Pandit, Pandit as it was pronounced. She was the sister of Nehru, who was the Prime Minister, of course, of Free India. And what we can say is that she is the first woman to put her finger on things. She said, I see on almost every article a reference to an individual type called a man. I don't see any reference whatsoever to women. How do all of these articles and resolutions relate to women? Well, now is the time to remind you that the woman to whom they were referred was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, whom, of course, Harry Truman was highly appreciative, and whom he asked to serve as one of the delegation of the United Nations, of the United States to the United Nations. And he was glad to see the UN immediately take this best-known humanitarian of perhaps any other of all Americans of that period in the world at large. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chairperson then, the chairwoman. We were very polite to the gentlemen in those years. We always said, Madam Roosevelt. We always said simple things like, Madam Chairwoman. It sounded too strange to me. I had trouble saying Madam Chairwoman. It sounded too much like Charwoman. But the solutions of international economic, social, health, and related problems began to take form. Now I come to the final section for which I will take your time. So the Charter was not complete for the United Nations until the fundamental philosophical groundwork had been done, and that was what we were assigned to do in the Declaration of Human Rights, labor. And there I must just make a little personal statement, as I was encouraged to do so by our president here, Mark Ritchie, today. My personal experience was that Dr. Melick telling me, get a leave of absence from where you're teaching or whatever you're doing. Howard, I need you. I want you to help me as my personal aid for the whole spread of my responsibilities. And I said, what's the job when I got to Geneva? What do you want done, Charles? He said, I want you to look at all the speeches and resolutions made in the founding of the Charter that created the United Nations, and all that they said about the power that should be given precisely the Human Rights Commission, and to interpret for me in a running fashion what that means for the whole Charter, since it's the foundation of the philosophy that creates it. The second thing that he said is, you can do that in the morning, just get up early. But I want you to be in the sessions of the Congress, of the Commission, every day from the time it begins, 10 o'clock, until whenever it ends, and that could be in the afternoon, as we found, or it could be pretty late in the evening. He said, I want you to sit behind me at the table, and that means you'll be behind Madam Roosevelt here, Charles as the rapporteur. I've been asked when I've used this word that's so common in diplomatic speech, French word in origin, rapporteur, does that just mean secretary? Well, I never say just secretary. I know how important secretaries are. But the rapporteur is beyond even that importance. He's something like the editor-in-chief with a power as a chairperson of sometimes conflicting groups of people who are not going to be easy to reach an agreement. He wanted me to be there, and that was like sitting on the 50-yard line at a football game. The president, Mrs. Roosevelt there, rapporteur there, and all the delegates of 18 nations, and the extraordinary tension that developed. And that's what I want to say something about now. work be set before this 18-country commission in 3 long sessions, 46, 47, 48, was at once delicate and it was heavy, even overwhelming. For it required the unlike-minded to philosophize together. Rooted in radically different cultures, these delegates were undertaking on a supranational basis to define, to codify, eventually to legislate, and to make binding legal treaties of the kind of concrete rights that have been mentioned, for example, in the economic sphere by the labor speakers this evening. The membership of the drafting commission, therefore, with such a comprehensive, inclusive responsibility, had to represent more than just themselves personally, though some of them were very distinguished professors and leaders in their own country. They had to be more than spokesmen for themselves and their own country. One of the most famous was René, forgive me, the family name comes slowly. He was a member of the alternative, or the opposite to what we call the Supreme Court, but his name is different, his organization in France. What he was able to do was defend the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that were so dear to the French ever since they voted them in the Revolution about 1889. The membership of this drafting commission then had to mirror proportionately the membership of the whole UN at that time. For example, 3 commission members came from dictatorial nationalist governments in the Middle East and Asia. 4 represented communist dictatorships in East Europe. 11 were from constitutional governments in the rest of Europe and the Americas and the Pacific region. All societies that operated more or less democratically, these constitutional governments. In half of the 18 countries elected to seats in the Commission, I think it will interest you to know, in half of them, most of the population was Christian by religion. In 3, it was Islamic. In 1, it was Hindu. And in 5, it was officially regarded as atheist, the socialist republics. The relationships between the several governments and their people's religions varied from all too cozy, sometimes you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, between the dominant religion and the dominant political parties, to neutralization of religion, to hostility, persecution of religion. So certainly when Moses carved the 10 Commandments on the tablets of stone, according to the book of Exodus in the Bible, the locus of authority was simpler than for us in Geneva, this very composite Human Rights Commission. How could it ever reach a conclusion? A BBC broadcast that I remember at the time quipped, about 18 politicians have been chosen to make a new draft of the Sermon on the Mount. The plenary sessions of the Commission were the scenes during 6 or 8 hours daily for many weeks of great debates, of head-on confrontations. Individual country representatives and various coalitions passionately sought the adoption of the product of their late-night drafting and editing. Then often they had to clear for political correctness in early morning telephone calls and telegrams to their respective bosses back home. From my fine vantage point, watching the sessions, as I told you, I could see that sometimes people were at the breaking point. The rapporteur, Charles Malik himself, broke the tension, at least for himself, by whispering to me in sometimes ironic observations of the pretentious diplomatic wind-up of certain members. Those chaps, he would say, they just have to boost their nation's self-respect by introducing every resolution they propose with that old formula, in behalf of my sovereign and independent nation, I propose. But Charles Malik added, we all know that there are but two sovereign and independent countries in this room, and they aren't that either. The drafty winds of the Cold War began to blow in around every window. The atomic bomb was becoming nuclear. Let me try to give you one illustration of what I mean by the Cold War blowing in around every window. At the outset, there had been the question posed by one of the Catholic delegates, what is the source of human rights, or any rights? What is the source of all rights? And the great 18th century declarations were cited. The American Declaration of Independence, the French Revolution, the Bill of Rights of America 50 years later, presupposed that humanity was endowed with certain natural rights by the Creator or by nature itself. But there was no way that the secularist or the atheist government of Eastern Europe in the middle of the 20th century would ever affirm such a mystical origin of human rights. They maintained that individuals, families, all institutions within the nation have only such rights as the nation state grants them, for it is the repository of all power and all ideological truth. They therefore held that all so-called human rights are but the gift of government in its wisdom, in its generosity. The constitutional governments, on the other hand, they argued, and especially the more democratic ones, that the fount of all power is in the very nature of the human being, that it is the governments themselves that have only such power and rights as the people choose to grant them. The democracy simply could not accept the secularist statist view. That is, the democratic people of whom I'm speaking in the Western democracies were very clear in their minds that there was no option that they could ever take home to their governments which would say all power is in the divine right of the parliament or the president, and whatever rights you as individual human beings have, it comes from them, and they can take it away just as they can give it. So the basic issue had to be finessed, and it was skillfully finessed in the preamble and first article of the Universal Declaration, which said, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act accordingly. So, brotherhood is the spirit that they wanted to encourage. The identity of the endower and the origin of humanity's moral sense are left unspoken, leaving all parties free to make their own silent assumptions. This declaration does not seek to explain what makes the human being unique and mysterious, as philosophers like ancient Ecclesiastes in the Bible and modern Albert Camus, the novelist, philosophical novelist in France in the time of the Second World War. regarded man as a stranger in the universe, unlike anything else that science had ever discovered. And yet, the emphasis on responsible behavior, liberty, equality, and fraternity were argued as the source of human rights. Well, I'm going to jump. You'll notice the lack of a connecting link in between. I wanted to tell you that when we had said all these things to each other, and I did not have the right to speak in the sessions, but I was frequently the troubleshooter sent by the rapporteur to get two sides together in a seminar room and see what we could work out to agree or overcome a sharp conflict of view. So, I take it for granted that you've read the Human Rights Declaration, and I'll not list all the specifics that were necessary to hear about in terms of things that need to be straightened out with our economic representatives abroad, according to the labor people. So not giving you any examples of that, I want to say this is how we began to feel the Cold War entering our very sessions. The stark difference between the assumptions and the styles of the rights envisaged by the two coalitions, Western with governments of limited power and a people of full reserve power, versus East European with governments exercising a monopoly of power and the people having no principled claim on power, led many to feel that an agreed universal declaration was simply unattainable. At one point, the Cold War all around us turned into a blazing fire. The United Kingdom delegate, a senior labor leader, by the way, Lord Duxton, could no longer stand the persistent effort of his table neighbor, Soviet delegate, for United Kingdom and United States and United Socialist Republic, because people sit in sessions of the United Nations by alphabetical arrangement of their desks. So those three that were not always very happy with each other sat next to each other, and this is what happened. The United Kingdom delegate no longer stand the resistant effort of his table neighbor, the Soviet delegate, to exclude from the declaration all guarantees of intellectual and spiritual rights and political and civil liberties. So interrupting the Soviet professor's passionate rhetoric, Lord Duxton cried out, "This declaration must uphold as a model for all humanity the figure of free men, not well-fed slaves." The Soviet delegate was quick to interrupt him and said, "Free men, Lord Duxton, even poets, can die of hunger." Rapporteur Malik sought to overcome the spurious, repetitive opposition between the two blocs. He knew that in spite of Cold War rivalry, probably everyone in the room wanted both sets of rights for himself and for his country, the civil and political, the economic and social. He wanted them enshrined in the UN Declaration. Malik pointed out that their recognition and application would be possible, however, only in the kind of atmosphere depicted in one of the final articles of the Commission's proposed draft, which says everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. And he surely spoke for most of the nations of the world when he concluded, "Cooperation between East and West is itself a right that all humanity now claims."